All right. Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening. Shalom, goeienaand, mense, and welcome to another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Again, apologies for that delayed response. You can thank Andre Dureta and ESCOM for for the late start of the show. We just finished a round of load shedding here in Cape Town, um, in the wonderful mother city. I'm actually in Sea Point area, and yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful evening aside from the spell of darkness that we've just gone through. BDL show, of course, is just a 25-minute, 30-minute show or so as we look at a topical issue, something I want to talk about in the midweek as we ramp up to Liberty and Friends on Sunday. Liberty and Friends, of course, being my one long format show where we take our time in looking at the news items, the things that made news headlines in the week. So why don't you join me on Sunday at 8 p.m. for that? In the meantime, welcome to it. This is the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Usihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. I'm hoping the sound is pashash. You're gonna have to forgive me, people. I didn't spend my usual sort of 10 minutes or so doing sound checks prior to the show. So yeah, so if you guys can actually hear me, I'm okay. There's no complaints in the comment section, so it's a good start. So welcome to it. This is the BDL show. Tonight on the BDL show, we discuss a problem which I think, and I can telegraph right now, will be the defining issue of today, and that is inflation. The economy, dear South African, is heading in a downward spiral. And this is aside from the South African economy. We are talking the global economy, having come from the COVID theater that was the spicy cough, and specifically the response that governments and politicians decided to embark on, which basically saw them shutting down the economy, shutting down jobs that people need for survival, shutting down the very economic lubricant that is, you know, the individual in an economy, shutting down, of course, as I said, economic development, and instead, in its place, telling people to stay home, they said, if you remember all of that nonsense, and effectively creating the rather, how does one describe this? I'll call it statist, just to be polite, but the statist illusion that somehow government can look after you, whether it was under the pretext of the pandemic or what I think they're doing. That is, who is they? The establishment, these politicians, really, who are on the left of the spectrum. The left being broadly people who believe the state should be the be all end all of power in society. All state should reside, all power, pardon me, should reside in the state. These are people who run a spectrum. We call them statists, socialists, and the very end of that spectrum, if you will, are the communists. The people you often hear me say are the red in tooth and claw types. These are people who basically believe the state should own everything, the state should do everything, and the state should control everything. And in doing so, the spicy cough and the lockdown period was a perfect, almost jerk circle for them, in the sense of they did exactly that. They owned everything by shutting down all private enterprise. Um, they controlled everything in the sense that politicians around the world were setting out all sorts of, random arbitrary rules and enforcing them, of course, using state violence. That's something I always need to remind people, that, all government edicts, all government laws, all government regulations are backed up by violence by a police officer or violence by a military official. We saw that here in South Africa. And of course, the state spent money like there was no tomorrow. It's that spending, it's that part which we're going to discuss tonight, because the effects of that, the consequences of that, have been inflation. Remember, inflation in a monetary sense, in a currency sense, is the moment you have more of something than is actually required. Okay, hang on. Let me take two steps back here. The more of something you create, the less of value it is. That is a simplistic, if you will, definition of inflation coming from me, a layperson. But hey, don't take it from the layperson. I'm going to bring on an economist here tonight who will help us unpack this particular issue of what is inflation, why is it a big danger for you, the South African family, right at the moment, and what can we expect going forward as things become tougher and tougher for us economically. Speaking about that very economist, I'm talking, of course, about Bheki Mahlobo, who you all know as being part of the Center for Risk Analysis. But I hear he has a new job on the horizon. Bheki, good evening.
Good evening, Sihle. Thank you so much for having me on. It must be really cold there in Sea Point. I was there myself just a few months ago and it was already cold, so you can imagine how it is now in winter. So, thank you so much for having me on, and good evening to your viewers.
Excellent, 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 Buti. Brother. We're gonna cut straight to it because I think there is a very important conversation that we need to unpack here because I don't think a lot of South African families, hardworking people as they are,
Hmm.
and including those who maybe have the misfortune of not being in a position of being able to work, the unemployed in this country. I think both of those segments of South Africans don't really see what's coming their way. They don't see the freight train coming their way. We can feel it right now, of course, with the prices of things being up, as how we often speak about inflation. But in real terms, let's begin maybe at the basic point. What is inflation, Beggy? What does it mean when we say an economy is or rather, what is inflation? Period.
Yeah, that's a very good question there, Sihle. And the reason why it is such a good question is that we've seen many analysts, many economists confuse the term inflation. But really, what inflation is the erosion of the purchasing power of households in South Africa, be it in South Africa or be it in the United States, and it's caused by the printing of money as well as that of reduction of interest rates, which results in an increase in money supply in each respective economy. What happened during the pandemic, there, Sihle, is that you had a lot of central banks responding to the pandemic by lowering interest rates as well as that of printing money. The quantum of stimulus that we've seen during the 2020 pandemic has been unimaginable. The amount of money that was printed by the developed world, as well as here in South Africa. Now, central banks often don't face as much criticism as that of government institutions, but they are themselves governments, and their actions carry large repercussions for the citizens in each respective economy. Now, unfortunately, due to the quantum of stimulus that we've seen since coming from the pandemic, as well as those lockdowns imposed, that has had a dramatic impact on businesses, as well as a dramatic impact on global supply chain and therefore trade. We've seen a rise in consumer inflation, which you can see this with the fuel price.
Mm,
Now, what this means, unfortunately, for a country like South Africa, where our employment numbers have not recovered to 2019 levels, we're still about 1.5 million South Africans short that have lost their jobs, and those individuals face little prospects of recovering those employment levels. Our income levels, looking at it per GDP per capita level, as well as disposable income, are lower than when Thabo Mbeki left office in 2008. So
mm.
you're seeing a decline in income levels while you're seeing inflation rise. So stats say recently published that South Africa's inflation, or measured by looking at consumer prices, is sitting at about 6.5%. That's overall inflation. But looking at the individual food items they see here, for example, such as that of meat, that has increased close to 10%, such as that of oil used for cooking has increased to close to 30%, public transportation above 10%. These increases in price levels negatively impact households that face very small income budgets, and unfortunately, it erodes their income level, their real income levels.
Peggy, I'm going to get to that in a moment because I prepared a nice little package here. Firstly, where this conversation, for me at least, even stemmed. It's getting really scary, Peggy, for those of us
Mm.
who have seen this bullet train before and are watching it head directly at consumers, whether that be consumers here in South Africa or around the world. But this is the headline that actually basically caught my attention and actually prompted me to have a conversation with you. The Germans, the strongest economy in Europe, basically. Bang. This is the headline. You saw German producer price inflation surges to an insane An insane 33.6% in the month of May, the highest level since 1949. And just as I even say that, I then said to myself, well, hang on. When they say it surges to 33%, where was it before? And this is where I sourced a little bit of data here. If we can just get onto the screen, there it is. Look at that, Biggie. Scary, scary, scary figure that. Jumping to about 33.6%. Look at where it nearly was before that. Way, way, way at the bottom of the screen there. These are freaky, freaky numbers, Biggie. And of course, the question then becomes, as you look at this data, Biggie, firstly, what is producer price inflation? Let's just maybe explain that for the viewer. And why will this spike like this affect effectively that CPI number, which is the inflation people ordinarily feel on a day-to-day basis?
Mm. Yeah. So what producer price inflation is the change in producer input costs that is measured by the PPI. Stats SA also publishes this data. The highest level, as you've rightly pointed out there, Sihle, is seen in Germany, as their producer price inflation is now above 30%. Now, what it means is that it's now more expensive for businesses to produce their products as their input costs have risen, such as that of fuel prices, such as that of energy prices, that has led to an increase in producer price inflation in the European region. This comes from largely two things. The first one is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that as well as that of that has had pressure on global supply chains as well as that of global trade. However, it should also not be forgotten what happened to with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as much of the world was in lockdown. So a lot of these businesses were restricted, which disrupted supply chains around globally, which then led to an increase in price levels when you're looking at freight containers as well as the shipping of goods around the world. So unfortunately, that's what has happened to businesses. Now, the important thing with the producer price inflation is that once you start to see a rise in producer inflation numbers, they then carry that increases onto consumers. So it works as a really good indication of what's to come. South
Mm,
Africa's producer price inflation is now above 10%, which is very high. It's lower than that compared to Germany, but it's still historically high. This means that our inflation levels will also continue to rise. But a point that I would like to emphasize here, Sihle, is that I've
mhm,
seen a lot of analysts, a lot of politicians, primarily from the left, blaming these price increases on businesses, saying that businesses are really greedy, they price gouging, therefore they need more regulation. If you're, for example, the common example I'm seeing right now is what's happening in the United States, where the
mhm.
high levels, the 40-year high level of inflation in the US is being blamed on meat packers or beer industry in the United States. But largely, the consequences of the source of the high levels of inflation that we're seeing in the United States, as well as from a global perspective, has largely been to the government's response towards the pandemic, such as that of
Absolutely.
money printing, such as that of lockdown, which has absolutely disrupted supply chains. And unfortunately, it is now these businesses, the very same businesses that were shut down from operating, that are now blamed for these high prices.
And that's the kicker here, Biggie, is that ideas matter, specifically bad ideas from politicians, bad policies from politicians have effects. And we're seeing those effects right now. And by the way, it's not just the Germans, and this is the package I wanted to get into. The inflation monster is growing worldwide. Here's the Canadians, Biggie. I'm just going to put it on screen.
Mm,
Their CPI numbers jumped to 7.7%. A lot of pressure being applied right now to their prime minister, Justin Trudeau, who, much like, as you pointed out, Biggie, was the same kind of politician who was printing money during the lockdown. The Americans were putting out those stimulus checks, if you remember that,
yeah,
that they were
yeah.
sending to Americans. The Canadians are doing the exact same thing. South Africa, to an extent, a less extent, but an extent nonetheless, is doing the same thing, still is, with those 350 Rand payments that it made and is still making to people under the pretext of the lockdown. Here's another. There's that American data you were talking about, where their index screamed up. That's Americans. Their inflation screamed up to 8.6%. These are frightening numbers. And just as a last little slide here, I wanted to put this up just to give a global context as to, these are single digit numbers to an extent. Obviously, the Germans being at 33%. They're not an isolated number. I mean, have a look at this data put together by Professor Steve Hank from
Mm.
John Hopkins University. Look at some of these countries. When you look at the scary numbers that inflation can get to. Now, Peggy, as you said, it's the erosion of the very value of the currency that people have, whether it's in their
Mm.
pocket, in their savings accounts, in their bank accounts, whatever. And if you look at some of these numbers here, it would be an absolute travesty if South Africa started heading in this direction. What have we seen, Peggy, historically when inflation is super high in countries around the world? What happens to the social stability of those countries?
It is the complete destruction of social stability in each region. Unfortunately, they see Cecile, because money is used in exchange for goods.
Mm,
And so once you start to see the erosion of that currency, unfortunately, things become more expensive to the point where millions of people, like, for example, in that chart that you've pulled there, such as Venezuela, face massive starvation levels to the point where, in fact, to buy a loaf of bread, you would need a wheelbarrow of the Venezuelan currency in order to just get a one loaf of bread, because prices are so volatile and are so increasing to an upward trajectory. This
mm,
destroys savings, this destroys families, this destroys households. It's very important that central banks hold tightly in terms of monetary policy, and they do not print themselves their way to prosperity. I mean, if if printing your way to prosperity was really the truly successful way of growing the economy, then Venezuela would have, as well as Zimbabwe, would have been a successful economy today.
mm,
But unfortunately, what we're seeing in these countries as a result of money printing is that of high levels of poverty levels in the country. And this is something that I'd like to actually also talk about, that
mm,
the sweeping ideology, which you've mentioned, bad ideology shaping bad policy, that's now taking hold of some central banks around the world, being that of modern monetary theory, which
mhm,
is the belief that a country can print itself out of debt. Uh, Even after coming off the pandemic, countries have now faced high debt levels. South Africa added 20% to its debt levels, which has also favored some politicians to say that we should therefore start to print our way out of these debt levels. The consequences will be dramatically dire in terms of higher prices for ordinary South Africans that unfortunately erode their real income levels.
mm. And again, even as we look to taper off the conversation, we're in the last 8 or so minutes of the show. Welcome to it if you've just joined us. You've missed our economist, Bheki Mahlobo, breaking it down for you as to the dangers of inflation and really how inflation can become, if unchecked, a sort of runaway situation that destabilizes societies. One doesn't have to look far, Bheki, in that regard. I mean, Zimbabweans, our neighbors to the north, are a classic example of that. When their inflation began to hyperinflate. That is, basically runaway inflation. I mean, you saw that in that graph. The Zim dollar still experiences 360, I think it was 365% inflation year on year. It has significant implications for the quality of life of ordinary citizens, in that case, Zimbabweans, a lot of whom now find themselves being refugees, economic migrants and economic refugees, if you will, in other parts of the world, including here in South Africa. But even as I said that, let's go to that South African example, Biggie. You made mention of it aptly at the beginning. Our inflation rate breaking that inflation targeting barrier, now sitting at 6.5%. What is that barrier exactly? Inflation targeting barrier, Beggy, as you explained it. And I'll get into the next graph in a moment, which looks at the individual items and how they've inflated, if that's how I word that.
Yeah, so what the inflation target band is set by the South African Reserve Bank, South Africa's central bank, because their main objective, as they state through through their meetings, is that of price stability in the country. The range in which they determine to achieve price stability is between that target range of 3 to 6% of inflation. However, they try to aim for inflation to be at about 4.5%. Now, what it means when South African inflation is above that target band, it determines interest rates in the country. Now, what interest rates are is if you have a home loan, a car loan, or consumable goods that you've purchased on loan, the bank charges you an interest rate on that. And if you start to see a rise in interest rates determined by the South African Central Bank through the repo rate, then it also impacts you in terms of your car loan, your home loan, and so forth. So by the South African Reserve Bank trying to increase interest rates. What they try to do is that they're trying to dampen the consumer appetite for debt and trying to lessen consumers on spending. Now, it will become more expensive for looking at these inflation numbers. The SARB will continue to hike rates in order to get inflation below that target band or below 4.5%. This means it will become more expensive for households that are in debt to service their debt. It will be more expensive for businesses to take out investments as well as to service the investments that are based on credit, as well as the appetite for buying car vehicles or buying houses on mortgages will become less, the consumers will demand less of these items, largely due to the rise of interest rates in the country. So, unfortunately, once you start to see a rise in interest rates in the country, unfortunately, that results in a slowdown of economic activity. Now, that is in the context where the South African economy has struggled to surpass 2% GDP over the past 10 years, even on a quarterly basis. A
Mm.
few weeks ago, the SC Stats SA published that South Africa's GDP has now reached 2019 levels, pre-pandemic levels. However, it should not be forgotten that South Africa has experienced a decade long of economic stagnation. And the fact that we've reached 2019 levels just means that we've moved from a deep contraction due to the COVID-19 lockdowns to one of economic stagnation. And on top of that economic stagnation, we're now faced with rising interest rates, which will slow down growth. Not only in South Africa, but this is also a risk from a global perspective. Once also you're seeing this from the US Fed hiking interest rates, as well as European central banks hiking interest rates, which will drive down global growth, negatively also impacting South Africa in the coming months.
Mm. And this is perhaps where we need to taper off the conversation, um, by bringing it home to the average South African. On this show, Biggie, we often talk a lot about, sorry, I'm trapped by my own sentence construction here. Let me take two steps back. I talk a lot about, always bringing these higher concepts into an everyday language so that the people who we are talking about and the people who we're advocating for in terms of our ideas that err on the side of liberty, that err on the side of markets, free trade, and creating prosperity for all people so that they can understand these concepts in an everyday language. And an everyday language, perhaps, even as I put this graph up, is indicative of what I'm talking about here. This is the inflation rate of certain items on an itemized basis, if you will. And you can see, Beggy, here that even as we're talking about the overall consumer price index being 6.5%, if you begin to look at what's driving that overall number, people are feeling it in a very painful way in the very items that fill up their basket. In Zulu Begi, we have this expression saying, "Uma bambu yega," right? It's loosely translated as you pick something up and you leave it again, and that's almost how if you walk into any grocery store, the average consumer is becoming a Bamba Yaga type shopper where you live something which you're actually quite used to buying, but you're having to put it back because the price of it is has become so much higher, or more aptly, the rand you have in your pocket is eroded to a point where you can't even afford those items before. Biggie, just do you want to pick a few of these items here on screen and talk to us about what this will mean for the consumer going forward? And even as I say that, I remember a good friend of mine and someone who you and I both knew, Ian Cruikshanks, who
Mm,
passed away this year, who he always used to say, when you look at economic data, ask yourself the question, what does it mean for us?
exactly. Exactly there, Sihle. And the best way to answer this question is to follow the daily life of an ordinary South African from the time they wake up to the time they make their first breakfast meal and they go to work. It will mean that it's going to be more expensive for these households to eat, such as food items then, which you have picked up there, such as that of the price of bologna and the cucumber price as well as them for them to go to work. We've seen the high increases in fuel prices, for example. In fact, here, Sihle, if the fuel price goes above 25 rands per liter, it'll mean it'll be 50% more expensive for motorists to go to work, 50% more expensive for goods to travel around the country, impacting households' budget when it comes to groceries, as well as that of public transportations, with the recent read that taxis are increasing their taxi fees. You can also see this with sunflower oil, for example, there on the screen here, increasing close to
Mhm.
40%. 40% on oils used for cooking. That is a dramatic increase there, Sihle. And unfortunately, this will negatively impact budgets for households in the country. One point I would love to, not necessarily love, because this is quite dire numbers, is the consequences once you start seeing an environment of high prices, which you're showing on the chart here, Sihle, in the context of very high levels of poverty levels in the country. Currently, there's about 12.5 million South Africans that are unemployed. Last week was June 16, with a youth unemployment rate of about 75%.
Mm.
Once you start seeing those declines in in living conditions mixed in with rising prices, then unfortunately you therefore have a situation where you're going to start to see a rise in social unrest as well as political instability, because we're seeing a rise in basic necessities such as that of bread, such as that of fuel, such as the way of living for people. It's simply becoming unbearable for these people to go about their daily lives because they face such declining income levels due to a low growth environment, which has been as a result of the policies that have been implemented over the past 10 years. Mm.
And unfortunately, that's where we have to end it. But I think it's ended at the right place in terms of me not wanting to create a false impression of, happy clappy, oh, everything's okay, you'll be fine. We're not the corporate media. Here we'll tell you the truth and we'll give it to you in a unfiltered fashion. Big, actually, before maybe I let you go, I think it would be a good place to end with, we've spoken about the bad ideas, we've spoken about why in effect we're here. I suppose the question anybody would ask themselves now is, what do we do about this, right? Um, Unfortunately, I'm of the view that there's nothing that the individual consumer perhaps can necessarily do to stave themselves off from the bad effects of inflation. But there's surely things we can do as a society, as pushing the alternative ideas, if you will, to combat inflation. What needs to happen now, Big? If I gave you that magic wand and unfettered power, if you will, to determine economic policy, how do we cut the inflation and, of course, grow the economy?
Yeah. So a, a bit to touch on what the ordinary South African can do in the context of high inflation numbers and rising interest rates. The first thing, if I was in a household that is hugely indebted, is to cut down on your mortgage payments as well as to cut down on your debt payments. That will save you in terms of interest rates, as the country will see higher interest rates being increased in the coming months. That's the first thing I would do as a household. Another thing which is needed here, Sihle, is income levels. We need jobs. We need an economy that grows. That would mean the scrapping of policies that restrict our employment levels to the point where they've stagnated over the past 10 years. It would mean implementing reforms such as scrapping EWC, scrapping any forms of nationalizations to South African institutions such as healthcare through the NHI, scrapping these policies, implementing policies that would see a rise in growth levels in the country, as well as a rise in employment levels, as South Africans need an income, a form of income, in order to sustain themselves and their families in this inflationary environment. From a central bank perspective, yes, Sihle, I have to say that even though South Africa did cut interest rates and as well as print money, we do not print it to the same extent as well as what we see in the United States as well as in the European Union. But however, what we need to do is that the response by the Sejus Kganyago has been a justful one. Unfortunately, it does have expensive consequences for ordinary South Africans. However, we need to defend the central bank as well, as it has faced some form of attacks over the past 2 years, such as that of money printing. So therefore, we need to strengthen the independence of the central bank, and look at this from an income perspective for ordinary South Africans. I think another thing here that needs to be done is the strengthening of communities in these very trying times. Looking out for your neighbor, assisting them where they can, buying them groceries if they cannot afford to buy groceries. I think this is like definitely what communities need to do, as what's happening in this environment that we find ourselves in here, CJ.
Mm, absolutely. And maybe, Bheki, that is actually where we're going to end it off. That is, of course, Bheki Mahlobo from the Center for Risk Analysis. I saw in the comment section here, Bheki, people were asking, where's Bheki going? Are we losing him? I don't know if you want to share that. It's up to you completely as to where you'll be.
Well, I can share it. I think it's like public knowledge now.
Yeah.
So I'm not leaving Big Daddy Liberty or any other of the commitments that I've done from the broader institute. I'll still be quite visible. I'll still accept every interview request that Sihle offers to me, and I'd love to chat to him all the time. Where I'm going is really like financial markets because that's my deep interest. Answering this question of inflation, where does inflation come from, answering where financial markets are heading, which impact pensioners, which impact ordinary South African households. And I'll be doing this through ETM, which is a company that shares the same values as the IR, which I thought is a very important point, as they see
Absolutely.
the issues that the country faces, not only the country, but as well as from a global perspective. So that's where I'm
Absolutely.
heading. But
And
I'm still
indeed,
around. I'm not leaving. This is not a goodbye.
well, there you go. And as about to say, ETM Analytics being a very good friend of the BDL show. So we'll make sure we have Bheki Mahlobo. And indeed, Russell Lamberti, shout out to him over on the show. That's Bheki Mahlobo from the Center for Risk Analysis on the show. And I must quickly say, even though I've just let him go, Bheki Mahlobo, him, man, people are watching this homie. And in fact, a very good friend of mine, a very respected economist in this country, saying Bheki is on the track of being one of the best economists in the country. Glowing endorsement of Bheki, and we're very glad that he's a friend of this channel. So let me know what you think, by the way, of the topic. Are you rightly worried and maybe looking to take some of that advice that Bheki gave us of cutting down the debt as much as we possibly can, and building a stronger sense of community, helping our neighbors, because the times are getting tougher and tougher, and that advice is going to be very salient and very um, good, weighty, if you will, as we head forward. And I had to share this issue because it's something that is going to be the topic of the next at least 3 to 5 years, as I view it, indeed. So let me know what you think about that. What are you doing? How are you seeing inflation affect you? Pop that in the comment section. I'll super appreciate that. And maybe with that being said, let me say goodbye to you guys. I'll probably start releasing a few short videos every now and then between now and Sunday. But other than that, I will see you on Sunday for Liberty and Friends at 8 p.m. at 8 p.m. on Sunday. With that being said, thank you for watching. And remember, as I like to say at the end of every broadcast, never trust a commie.